Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, in her life of service, we saw that abiding love of tradition, damaging nature by not understanding how much we depend on.
The demand did not arrive through ordinary royal channels. It came late, marked private, carrying Meghan's name and a request palace officials had feared for months. She wanted Charles alone, without advisors, without Camilla, and most importantly William knowing what she intended to reveal. The message reached Charles's private office after the palace had fallen quiet, long after routine correspondence had been cleared and the final briefings of the day were supposed to be over. It was not written like an invitation to repair a damaged family bond. It carried the force of a warning. Meghan was asking for a confidential audience with the king, and the careful wording made it clear that she would not accept a substitute, an intermediary, or a carefully managed palace conversation. She claimed the matter concerned Harry's future, promises that had never been resolved, and private family agreements that could not safely be discussed through lawyers. Every sentence appeared controlled, but beneath that control was urgency. Meghan suggested that too many conversations had already been filtered through officials, softened by courtiers, or reduced to formal statements that failed to reflect what had truly been said behind closed doors. Her conditions caused immediate alarm. William was not to be present. Camilla was not to be informed in advance. No private secretary, senior advisor, lawyer, or official note-taker could enter the room. Meghan wanted Charles alone, with no witness able to interrupt, interpret, or later challenge the meaning of their exchange. To palace officials, that secrecy looked dangerous. A conversation without a record could later become two different stories. A promise remembered by one side might be denied by the other. A private sentence could be leaked, reshaped, or presented as proof that the Crown had admitted wrongdoing. Yet Charles could not dismiss the request as easily as those around him hoped. He remained deeply wounded by Harry and Meghan's public accusations, but anger had never completely erased fear. Somewhere beneath the authority of the Crown was a father who believed his younger son was slipping further away. Harry was no longer merely distant. He was angry, suspicious, and increasingly convinced that every royal door had been quietly closed against him. Then came the phrase that changed the mood entirely. Meghan referred to an understanding reached during the couple's final months as working royals, an arrangement Charles allegedly knew about, but which had never appeared in the official departure documents. She connected it to protection, inheritance, family security, and the future position of Harry's children. That was when the request stopped looking like reconciliation. It began to resemble a reckoning. Before Charles could decide whether to respond, one senior aide made a choice that would transform the private demand into a royal power struggle. The message was quietly forwarded to William. By sunrise, Meghan's demand was no longer a private request between a daughter-in-law and a king, because William had read every word, and one phrase convinced him that the meeting could not be allowed to happen. William did not react to Meghan's anger, her urgency, or even her demand for secrecy. He reacted to 6 carefully chosen words buried near the end of the message, words suggesting Charles had once made a promise the palace had deliberately kept from the future king. The phrase was simple: Charles must honor what was privately agreed. Meghan offered no full explanation, no dates, and no clear description of what the agreement involved. That silence made it more threatening. To William, it sounded less like a request and more like a claim waiting to be enforced. A private promise involving Harry could never remain private forever. If it concerned royal status, money, security, inheritance, or the position of the children, William might one day be expected to uphold a commitment he had never approved and had not even known existed. He was preparing to inherit the monarchy. Yet Meghan's words suggested that decisions affecting its future had been made behind his back. his fear went deeper than policy. William knew Charles could become emotionally vulnerable whenever Harry was involved. The king carried guilt over Diana, pain over the brothers' collapse, and regret over the distance separating him from his grandchildren. Meghan did not need to threaten him openly. She only needed to remind him of everything he had lost. That was why William distrusted the demand for privacy. He did not believe Meghan merely wanted to protect Harry from palace pressure. He suspected she wanted a conversation without witnesses, one that could later be described publicly in whatever terms best supported her case. Charles might remember reassurance. Meghan might call it a guarantee. William had seen disagreements change shape before. Decisions he believed were necessary to protect royal procedure had later been presented as coldness, jealousy, or personal hostility. Each time, the institution disappeared from the story, leaving him cast as the obstacle. Now he feared the same pattern was returning, but with far greater consequences. The mention of Harry's children made the danger feel immediate. A private meeting could lead to promises of financial support, security protection, ceremonial recognition, or future royal roles. Even a symbolic gesture from Charles could become an expectation William would later struggle to reverse. Inside the palace, advisors divided quickly. Some warned that refusing Meghan would make the crown appear afraid of what she knew. Others argued that granting the meeting could create an emotional and constitutional crisis with no reliable record of what had been said. Charles, however, initially leaned toward hearing her. He believed one direct conversation might prevent another public attack and perhaps reopen a path toward Harry. William saw hope where he saw risk. He stopped preparing advice and began preparing an intervention. Before any invitation could be issued, he would make certain the meeting never reached the calendar. William's next move would cross a line no one inside the palace could ignore. Because he was no longer asking Charles to reconsider, he was preparing to block the meeting in the king's own household. Charles had spent years waiting for a private opening from Harry's side. But when it finally appeared, it came through Meghan and carried conditions that felt dangerously calculated. Accepting could expose the monarchy. Refusing could confirm every accusation that the family had chosen power over reconciliation. For Charles, the choice was not simply royal. It was painfully personal. As king, he was expected to protect the crown from uncertainty, private deals, and conversations that could later be turned against the institution. As a father, he understood that every rejected approach might push Harry beyond the point of return. One refusal could become another wound. Another silence could become permanent separation. Charles began to wonder whether Meghan was speaking because Harry could not. Perhaps his son was too angry to ask for help, too proud to admit regret, or too afraid that another attempt at reconciliation would end in humiliation. That possibility gave Charles hope. Behind Meghan's hard conditions, he imagined an indirect appeal from Harry. A door opened only slightly, but opened nonetheless. Camilla remained cautious. She did not demand that Charles refuse the meeting, nor did she pretend the family's pain could be solved through palace procedure. But she warned him that Meghan's insistence on excluding every witness would leave him dangerously exposed. A father might offer comfort. A king's comfort could later be presented as a commitment. The inheritance question made that danger sharper. Meghan allegedly wanted answers about what Harry had been promised, what his children might eventually receive, and whether living outside royal life would reduce their place within the family. Yet the palace separated such matters carefully. Private inheritance was not crown property. Royal residences were not personal gifts. Security was not ceremonial status. Family affection did not automatically create official entitlement. Meghan's demand threatened to pull all those boundaries into one emotional negotiation. Charles considered a compromise. A short meeting with one trusted secretary present and a written record sealed from public view. It would give Meghan privacy without leaving the conversation open to future dispute. But before the proposal could even be delivered, word returned that she would reject it. Advisors, she insisted, were part of the problem. Only Charles could correct what had happened. That accusation struck deeper than he admitted. Charles began questioning whether the palace had become too rigid during Harry and Meghan's departure, turning private pain into policy and unresolved promises into carefully worded protocol. Then William arrived without warning. Charles told him that hearing Meghan did not mean surrendering to her. William's reply was immediate and cold. Allowing the meeting under her conditions might already be the surrender. The argument that followed was not truly about whether Meghan should enter the room, it was about which son Charles was prepared to disappoint, and who now possessed the power to decide for him. Before Charles could send his reply, William acted. The proposed date disappeared from the private calendar, Meghan's conditions were rejected, and palace staff were instructed that no unsupervised access would be approved. The future king had blocked the meeting, and Charles had not publicly authorized him to do it. William did not announce his decision or confront Meghan directly. He used the machinery of the palace. Security clearance was withheld. Residence access was left unapproved. Scheduling officials were told that no private audience could be confirmed without a full briefing, and every possible route to Charles was quietly closed before an invitation could leave the king's office. To William, this was not rebellion. It was protection. He argued that a meeting involving disputed promises, inheritance concerns, security arrangements, and the future position of Harry's children could not happen without witnesses. There had to be notes. There had to be limits. There had to be someone present who could confirm exactly what Charles said and what Meghan demanded. Charles understood the danger, but his anger was unmistakable. William had acted as though the king could not control his own emotions, as though guilt over Harry had made him incapable of judgment. The insult was not public, but it cut deeply. Charles had spent his life waiting to rule, only to discover that his heir was already placing boundaries around his decisions. William refused to retreat. Meghan, he warned, was not asking only for reconciliation. She was asking for a private version of history that could later become the public version. The most explosive part of her request made that fear impossible to dismiss. Meghan wanted Charles to acknowledge that Harry had once received assurances about continued protection, direct family access, and the treatment of his children. She believed those assurances had later been weakened, reinterpreted, or quietly denied. William saw the trap immediately. If Charles admitted privately that such promises existed, the conversation could be presented as proof that the palace had misled Harry and Meghan during their departure. A father's attempt to comfort his son could become an institutional confession. Beneath the argument over procedure was a much darker struggle. Charles saw William's intervention as an attempt to control the reign before inheriting it. William saw his father's hesitation as evidence that old guilt still threatened the monarchy's future. When Harry learned what had happened, his reaction was fierce. To him, the blockage confirmed a fear he had carried for years. William was no longer merely his brother. He had become the gatekeeper standing between Harry and their father. Meghan answered differently. There was no public explosion, only a second message written with chilling precision. William's interference, she said, proved exactly why she had demanded privacy. Then came the warning. If Charles could not speak freely inside his own palace, she would find another way to establish what had been promised. William had prevented the meeting, but in doing so he had handed Meghan a more powerful argument, that the king's private wishes were being controlled, and she was now ready to prove it. The palace believed Meghan wanted concessions. The truth was more dangerous. She intended to confront Charles with a private record of conversations surrounding the Sussex departure dates, assurances, emotional appeals, and one alleged promise involving Harry that William had never been told existed. Her purpose was not simply to ask for money, titles, or a return to royal life. Meghan wanted Charles to answer for a promise she believed had been made during the final, painful negotiations before she and Harry stepped away. According to her account, Harry had been assured that leaving official duties would not mean losing his father's personal protection, his direct access to the family, or his children's place within it. The promise was never written into the formal agreement. That was exactly why the palace believed it could not be treated as binding. Meghan, however, claimed she had something more powerful than a legal document. She had private notes, saved correspondence, messages carried through trusted intermediaries, and recollections recorded immediately after crucial conversations. None of it might survive a courtroom battle. But this was not a courtroom. Emotionally, the material could be devastating. It suggested that Harry and Meghan had been offered comfort in private, while harsher restrictions were allowed to emerge in public. The palace could call that a misunderstanding. Harry called it betrayal. This was also why Meghan refused official witnesses. She believed courtiers would strip the conversation of its human meaning. A promise of protection would become a discussion about security classifications. A promise of family access would be reduced to scheduling procedure. A father's reassurance would be narrowed until it carried no responsibility at all. For Harry, the deepest wound had never been the loss of duties or ceremonial position. It was the belief that his father would preserve the family bond after the institutional bond was broken. He thought distance from the monarchy would not mean exile from the family. When that belief collapsed, so did much of his remaining trust. Meghan intended to ask Charles one direct question. Did he still stand behind what he had told Harry when the family was breaking apart? Charles learned the full purpose only after William had blocked the meeting. His resentment deepened immediately. He realized a decision had been made in his name before he understood the accusation at the heart of Meghan's demand. William remained unmoved. Undocumented assurances made during emotional conversations, he argued, could not shape the future of the crown. That was the divide in its clearest form. Harry saw a father's word. William saw a constitutional risk. Meghan understood that neither brother was truly arguing about procedure. They were fighting over whether love inside the royal family meant anything once power became involved. Against William's advice, Charles privately requested the complete message Meghan had intended to deliver. For the first time, Charles began looking beyond Meghan's demand and toward the promise at its center, but opening that buried chapter meant confronting the people who had helped close it. The greatest resistance did not come from William alone. Behind him stood officials who remembered the final Sussex negotiations and who knew the palace's public account had never fully captured the emotional promises made in private when Harry was threatening to walk away forever. Those courtiers understood why Meghan's records were dangerous. They had watched private conversations become official policy, and they knew the two rarely carried the same meaning. Behind closed doors, Charles may have spoken with warmth, guilt, and desperation. In formal documents, that emotion had been removed, replaced by careful limits that protected the institution. Palace language could change a promise without openly breaking it. "We will protect you" might later depend on security assessments, official duties, location, or government approval. "You will always be" family could offer emotional comfort while guaranteeing no funding, access, residence, or ceremonial place. Every reassuring sentence could be narrowed until it meant almost nothing. Some advisors had warned Charles about this from the beginning. They feared that personal assurances made as a father would eventually be heard as commitments made by a future king. Charles may have believed he was calming a wounded son. Harry may have believed the monarchy itself had given its word. That gap between intention and expectation had become the heart of the crisis. There was also a more troubling suspicion. William may have been deliberately kept outside certain conversations because relations between the brothers had already become too damaged. Officials feared his presence would harden Harry's position or destroy any chance of compromise. But for William, discovering that decisions affecting his future reign had been discussed without him felt like betrayal. He would inherit the consequences of promises he had never heard and agreements he had never approved. Meghan's belief grew stronger. The palace, she concluded, was not frightened by false accusations. It was frightened by private truths that could not be fitted neatly into official statements. Camilla urged Charles to move carefully. Reopening every conversation from the departure period, she warned, could destroy what little trust remained. Memories had hardened. Every person believed a different version. Then, one former aide produced notes suggesting Charles had indeed offered Harry personal reassurance. The wording did not prove the permanent guarantee Meghan claimed, but it was strong enough to show that Harry's belief had not appeared from nowhere. Charles turned to William and asked him to step back. He proposed a controlled meeting with Meghan, protected by confidentiality but no longer completely private. William refused to support it unless Harry attended. An official record was kept, and no promises were made behind closed doors. The conditions had changed, but the conflict had not. Meghan wanted Charles alone, William demanded Harry be present, and Charles now faced a choice that could expose whether this was truly reconciliation or a battle over who controlled the royal story. Harry had allowed Meghan to make the demand because he believed she could say what he no longer could. But when Charles insisted Harry attend any future meeting, the prince was forced into the confrontation he had avoided for years, facing his father without the protection of distance. Meghan had originally asked to see Charles alone for a reason. She feared Harry's grief, anger, and long history with his father would allow the palace to dismiss the discussion as another emotional dispute. The moment Harry entered the room, she believed every disputed promise would become secondary to his tone, his accusations, and the wounds neither side had ever resolved. Harry understood her reasoning. He trusted Meghan to defend their children and challenge the palace language that had reduced private assurances to technical misunderstandings. Yet he also feared what her confrontation might cost. His connection to Charles was damaged, but not dead. One brutal meeting could destroy what little remained. His fury toward William only deepened the conflict. To Harry, blocking Meghan's request proved that his brother had assumed control over access to their father. William was no longer simply defending procedure. He had become the person deciding who could speak to the king and under what conditions. William's answer was unforgiving. Harry could not accuse the family publicly, send Meghan privately, and then refuse to appear when difficult questions had to be answered. Beneath their argument lay the shadow of Diana. Harry believed the promises made after their mother's death had taught him that the family would always protect him. William saw something different. He believed Diana's memory had become a shield placed around every disagreement, making Harry's claims emotionally powerful and almost impossible to challenge. Then, Charles bypassed the officials and sent Harry a personal message. He did not address him as a duke, claimant, or critic. He asked him to come as his son. The words reached the part of Harry that distance had never silenced. Meghan, however, feared the invitation was designed to separate them and weaken their united position. She reminded him that emotion had drawn him back before, only for him to leave feeling blamed, dismissed, and more alone. For the first time, Harry saw the trap on both sides. Meghan wanted to protect him from palace manipulation. William claimed to protect him from Meghan's pressure. Both were defending him in ways that also threatened to control him. Harry finally agreed to attend, but only if Meghan remained beside him and Charles answered directly for the disputed promises. William immediately declared that he would be present as well. What began as Meghan's demand for secrecy was becoming the most dangerous family meeting of Charles's reign, because every person entering the room carried a different version of the past, and only one could shape the future. No announcement was made. No official schedule carried their names. Yet, behind closed doors, Charles, William, Harry, and Meghan prepared to confront the promise that had poisoned years of silence. The meeting William once blocked was finally possible, but it would happen entirely on his conditions. Each person entered with a different purpose. Meghan wanted acknowledgement. Harry wanted emotional truth. William wanted to protect the institution from another disputed conversation. Charles wanted something more fragile than all of them, to stop his family from collapsing while he was still on the throne. The meeting was no longer private in the way Meghan had demanded. A confidential record would be kept. Trusted advisors remained close enough to be called in. Nothing said would become an immediate royal commitment, and no decision would be treated as binding without formal review. William had not prevented the confrontation forever. He had redesigned it. Meghan did not begin with old insults or public accusations. She went directly to the promise. She repeated the assurances Harry believed he had received and forced Charles to face the distance between what he had intended and what his son had understood. Charles did not deny offering reassurance. He admitted that he had spoken as a father during a moment of fear, telling Harry that he would remain loved, protected, and connected to the family. But he rejected the idea that those words guaranteed permanent royal privileges, automatic security, unrestricted access, or ceremonial status outside the system. For Harry, the distinction was devastating. It confirmed the belief that had haunted him for years. Inside the monarchy, love could be offered warmly and then limited by official language the moment it became inconvenient. William refused to apologize for blocking the original meeting. He argued that his intervention had stopped an unwitnessed conversation from becoming a future weapon against the crown. Meghan answered with equal force. The blockade, she said, proved the institution feared honesty unless it controlled the witnesses, the terms, and the final version of events. Then, Charles made the admission no advisor had wanted him to make. He accepted that procedure had replaced compassion during Harry and Meghan's departure. The family had hidden behind policy because direct emotion was too dangerous. Yet even that acknowledgement stopped short of the guarantees they wanted. Security remained unresolved. Inheritance remained uncertain. Access to Charles, the children's future, and any ceremonial role were left hanging between family affection and institutional control. William had protected the monarchy, but Charles now understood that his heir was willing to overrule his instincts. Harry received recognition but not restoration. Meghan gained no private promise, yet she finally confirmed where the real power rested. William blocked Meghan's meeting because he feared what Charles might concede, but did he protect the monarchy, or reveal that the future king already controls the present one? The doors eventually reopened, but the silence that followed carried its own warning. The meeting had ended without reconciliation. And the next battle would not be about what Charles once promised, it would be about who had the authority to speak for the crown.